fracking from a field in the Northern Territory could add 40 million tonnes to Australia's emissions and a further 60 million tonnes to global emissions when some of that gas is exported. That's 100 million tonnes a year. And that would increase Australia's emissions compared to today's emissions by about 7%, right? So it's absolutely massive.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
Dead, buried, cremated.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The treasurer.
Australia's basically done for. We'll just end up being a third-rate economy. You know, a banana republic.
How good is Australia?
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast demystifying the big economic issues in Australia and putting them in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and today we're going to talk about opening up new gas fields in the Northern Territory.
The Acting Prime Minister headed to Humpty Doo in Darwin's rural area today to announce $200 million in infrastructure investment in the Northern Territory.
Gas development in the Beetaloo Basin and a gas-fuelled petrochemicals precinct on Darwin Harbour.
This is an incredible bounty that our industry has discovered and is now appraising here in the Northern Territory.
That bounty comes in the form of liquids-rich gas, discovered in shale on the edge of the Northern Territory's Beetaloo Basin.
We can bring the gas resources of the Beetaloo online earlier, faster, safer, providing jobs sooner than was expected.
The Beetaloo slush fund stinks of corruption. It will be deadly for our climate.
The Australian people are paying for this folly, and it is entirely unacceptable.
And light the fuse on a giant climate time bomb.
Extracting gas from the NT through hydraulic fracturing or fracking is one of the largest potential sources of carbon pollution in the world. And there used to be a moratorium on fracking in the NT, but it was lifted with the caveats of dozens of recommendations, including that any domestic emissions resulting from unconventional gas are offset elsewhere. And now it looks like the government might backflip on that decision. So there's a lot at stake, and to unpack it all, we're going to be talking to Rod Campbell, Research Director at the Australia Institute, and Mark Ogue, Principal Advisor at the Institute, about exactly what is at stake here. G'day, Rod and Mark. Thanks for joining us.
Hi.
Hey, Eb.
Mark, I'm going to start with you. You've been working on NT gas for years now. Can you just set the scene for us? I know NT used to have a moratorium on fracking. Now that's been overturned. What's been happening in the past couple of years? Can you give us a catch-up for people who don't pay as much attention to it as the three of us?
Yeah, sure, Ebony. So before the current Labor government got in, fracking was all set to go in the Northern Territory. But there was a huge popular backlash against it from all sort of segments of society. It was hugely unpopular. And the Labor government basically got into power on the promise, well, in a significant extent, on the promise that it would have a moratorium on fracking. And so it instituted a moratorium, and then as part of that, it said it wouldn't lift the moratorium until it had had an inquiry into fracking. So they started up this scientific inquiry into fracking. It was a really big deal. It was headed by Justice Pepper, a former judge, and it went into a huge amount of detail. And they released their findings in February 2018, and they said that it wasn't their position to say whether fracking should go ahead or not, that was political, but that if it did, they had 135 recommendations with some fairly stringent requirements of work that needed to be done before it went ahead, and precautions that would have to be taken in order to reduce the level of risk to something that was acceptable. And the government committed to implementing all 135 recommendations, and it's been in the process of doing that ever since.
Hey, could I just back us a little further back up? Because I think it's worth unpacking just why fracking is so unpopular in the NT. I mean, I've done trips from Alice Springs to Darwin, stopping everywhere in between to talk about the economics of the gas industry, and you get a crowd in absolutely every pub you put up a sign and do the show in. You know, this is not like, some other political or environmental issues where, you might go to a local community and there's people who are against it and there's people who are for it, and, there's a large chunk of the community that doesn't really care. That's not the case with fracking in the NT. It's such a big deal because everyone in the NT generally realises how much they depend on their groundwater. If you live in Alice Springs, you know that you drink groundwater. If you live in Katherine, you know that going to the Katherine Hot Springs sees you soaking in groundwater. So everyone in the NT, whether they're fishing in it, bathing in it, drinking it, knows that they're really, really linked to their groundwater, and they generally don't trust the gas industry or Northern Territory government regulators to protect it. So, that's why it's a big deal, because it's a lot of gas. It's a big deal to us because it's a lot of emissions. But in the NT, it's a massive deal because people really care about their water.
Yeah. So to take us back to this scientific inquiry, Mark, they were looking into obviously overturning this moratorium with all these recommendations. You've said it was quite thorough. What types of recommendations did it include?
So there's a whole range of recommendations on engaging with Indigenous communities, with water, as Rod was saying, air quality, chemicals, and really importantly, greenhouse gas emissions. And that was where the Australia Institute got involved, because prior to us engaging with that process, the emissions from fracking in the Northern Territory wasn't really a big issue publicly, and also the inquiry in their draft report said that just didn't really highlight it at all as an issue. In fact, they said that the level of emissions weren't very great and that was acceptable. And so we did a lot of work in the Northern Territory pointing out.
I've got it in front of me. Can I tell you exactly what they said? They said the consequences of life cycle greenhouse gas emissions from a new field in the Northern Territory was low because it was 0.05% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah. Okay, so not a great draft or interim report.
No. And in fact, it's an absolutely massive amount of potential greenhouse gas, like a really major global source of potential greenhouse gas. And we pointed that out and said, look how massive the potential, how big this can be. And Rod's probably got it in front of him, but they did basically a 180-degree turn and said that actually the emissions from new gas fields would be unacceptable. And
yeah, I do have it in front of me. In fact, suddenly it's a high likelihood, a high risk, and became unacceptable.
Yeah.
So
pretty big turnaround.
That was a really big win for us, and particularly Mark, who worked really hard on this. The draft report said low consequences, and suddenly we were talking about a high risk activity in the final committee report, and that came, and Mark might be building up with this, to a key recommendation, and that was to offset the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions of any unconventional gas development in the Northern Territory.
Yeah, well, that what they actually said was there should be no net increase in life cycle greenhouse gas emissions emitted in Australia from onshore shale gas in the NT.
Okay, so just to recap for everyone who's playing along at home, the NT had a moratorium on fracking because it was massively unpopular. The government committed that it would only overturn that moratorium if this scientific inquiry said it was okay to do it, and the scientific inquiry went from an interim report that said the emissions were low risk, but there was a couple of other risks that could be managed, and the final report said actually there's a whole bunch of risks and these are our recommendations to manage them, including that the greenhouse gases are so huge that this project is an unacceptable risk unless you offset all of them. There can't be no net increase.
Exactly.
No net increase in the life cycle GHG, greenhouse gas emissions emitted in Australia from any offshore shale gas produced in the NT.
Yeah.
That's a quote.
Another notable omission from today's strategic plan is how the government will offset carbon emissions.
The Beetaloo gas fields alone will increase Australia's emissions by more than 5% of its life cycle emissions. That is unable to be offset in the Northern Territory.
Culture, of course, there's always offsets. There's always, we ensure that we are going to meet and beat our international requirements as far as reducing emissions.
In complete contradiction to our international commitment to keep global warming under 2 degrees, and against all expert advice that no new gas fields can be developed if the world is to limit warming to 1.5 degrees.
If we want to stop climate change, we have to stop polluting. If you want to stop polluting, you have to stop subsidising those who are polluting, those who are making money out of making climate change worse.
So, Mark, given how huge the resources are that we're talking about up there, you kind of said, you know, it's a huge carbon bomb, essentially. How big of an impact did that recommendation have? Did the government accept it?
Yeah, so the government accepted that.
It's like asking McDonald's to run the school canteen, paying them to do the school lunches, while you're trying to fight child obesity. There is no logic here. If we want to stop climate change, we have to stop polluting. If you want to stop polluting, you have to stop subsidising those who are polluting, those who are making money out of making climate change worse. This parliament should be doing that.
20 million tonnes to Australia's emissions and a further 60 million tonnes to global emissions when some of that gas is exported. That's 100 million tonnes a year. And that would increase Australia's emissions compared to today's emissions by about 7%, right? So it's absolutely massive.
Every year, 7% every year.
Every year, yeah. Australia's emissions would rise by around 7%.
That's huge.
So, which is phenomenal. And so basically what they were saying is that that's unacceptable, and that all of those emissions that are produced in Australia, which is that 7%, that 40 million tonnes, that should be fully offset. Now, if they fully offset that with Australian carbon credit units, which are the standard official carbon credits in Australia, that would cost billions of dollars every year. And remember that they're expected to rise. So modelling that the Australian government's done has shown that the price of carbon in Australia is likely to rise to about over $100 a tonne by 2030. So that number just keeps going up. And so that it would be a massive amount of money to offset that.
So basically they were looking for ways around it because it was going to jack up the cost of doing business and reduce all the profits they're hoping to make.
Absolutely. And so, yeah, the industry is desperately trying to stop the government from implementing that recommendation. And we've got to the point now where that pressure is working, and the government's trying to do a backflip on that and find ways to get around it.
So, Rod, you were talking about the massive kind of community opposition there being based around people's value of the groundwater potentially being contaminated. How big of a deal do you think it is for the government if it were to backflip on offsets? And would you expect then if they're backflipping on that, the community would then be worried, well, what are they doing with the rest of the recommendations?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think a big deal was made that all 135 recommendations of the Pepper inquiry were accepted and were going to be implemented. That's been repeated ad nauseum. It's been the catch line of, we can progress with the fracking industry because we stick to these 135 recommendations. And to be walking away from such a big and important one, I think would have some political impact in the NT. I don't want us to get sidetracked onto every issue, but this is far from the only recommendation of the fracking inquiry that questions are being raised around. We've certainly been looking at how information about the industry is provided to Indigenous communities We've been looking at cost recovery of the industry. There's a whole lot of other recommendations that Australia Institute and people like Environment Centre NT and Lock the Gate, Frack Free NT have all been pointing out that, there's a fair bit of crab walking and backsliding going on. But this is a big one, and it looks like being a big backflip.
Yeah.
The Territory Government isn't shying away from the fact that its new plan for a post-COVID economic recovery is a gas-fuelled one.
Which has been promoting a gas-led recovery out of the coronavirus recession.
The panel has advised the government to underwrite new gas pipelines and associated infrastructure to deliver cheap gas supply.
I don't have to go on with all this BS about a gas-led recovery, which is honestly just political piffle.
Gas is a fossil fuel. It is contributing both to the climate crisis and it's not necessarily going to help with our economic recovery either.
And Mark, this comes, I guess, in the context of Australia's so-called gas-fired recovery, even though there's no signs except for shoveling millions of dollars out the door that any of our recoveries gas-fired. But this big push to open the NT up for fracking, that's overall... It's part of a bigger push towards trying to get as much basically fossil fuels out of the ground while we can still sell it, it seems to me. Would that be right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's very, very dangerous. And what's happening is it's not about, it's being presented as supplying more gas to the east coast of Australia, but it's not about that at all. It's about exports, because the vast quantity of this gas is going to be exported. A little bit might go to Eastern Australia, but it's all about exports, and it's all about gas being exported by big global multinational companies who operate the export facilities. So without government subsidies, this would not be a viable project. And so what the government is doing is finding ways to give taxpayers money to these industries, whether it's through building, subsidising the roads. The federal government gave fracking companies $174 million to upgrade their roads for fracking trucks. They've thrown in another $50 million to help them with subsidies for exploration. And they're almost certainly looking at subsidising big pipelines that would connect these gas fields to export terminals. So it's taxpayers' money to help this get it over the line. And once they get it over the line, these big shale gas fields, they're not, there's no such thing as a boutique shale gas field, right? They're economies of scale. They're going to be massive. And that's going to have these massive greenhouse gas implications. And so the government's dead set on, basically pump priming the industry to make what would otherwise be a completely unviable industry, because it's such expensive gas and it's so remote, what would otherwise be commercially unviable, they're pump priming it to get it across the line.
Yeah, so Rod, we know from many previous episodes of the Australia Institute that we're not opposed to subsidies, but we want them to go to things we want more of, not things we want less of, including, fossil fuels like fracking for gas. So what are the kind of opportunity costs that we're talking about here? The governments, state and federal, are kind of handing taxpayer money out to gas companies hand over fist, building them roads, building them pipelines. And these are projects that, as Mark said, would probably otherwise be uneconomic because fracking's more expensive than, other kinds of drilling.
Let me just stop you there, Eb. It's not just Mark saying this. It's actually the fracking inquiry itself. Look, you won't find a gas industry person in Australia who's not linked to one of the actual companies who says that this is cheap, viable gas. The fracking inquiry's own economists, Aysel Allen, a consultancy beloved of the gas industry, found that the highest probability scenario was, without government subsidy, a failure to commercialise. I'm quoting there. Listeners probably can't see my air quotes.
But essentially it's a dud project.
Yeah, failure to commercialise was the fracking inquiry's most likely finding. And so Mark and I have had these various arguments over the years around, should we be emphasising the complete commercial disastrousness of this industry, or should we be emphasising the climate disastrousness of it? Are they mutually exclusive, and courtesy of hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayer money, no, they're not mutually exclusive. We can have economically disastrous gas projects and massive climate impacts as well. Thank you, taxpayer.
Oh, God, that's so depressing. And, you know, obviously you were talking about how much this is opposed, Rod, through all the communities from Alice upwards. So we are talking here about a massive opportunity cost. Every dollar that's going to these gas companies for these otherwise uneconomic projects that are going to increase greenhouse gas emissions and potentially contaminate their water, that's money that can't be spent on, I'm sure, public housing.
Oh, absolutely. There's huge housing and health issues in the Northern Territory. The government's currently trying to revamp what was called the Community Development Program, which is sort of code for remote area work for the dole. All of these things could be funded a lot better and produce much, much better outcomes for local communities in the NT or indeed the wider Australian community. But at the moment, the policy is shovel that money towards well-connected gas companies.
Almost $300 million of investment, 6,000 jobs for Territorians. The Beetaloo Basin, once that resource is firmed up, is expected to be one of the best basins in the world for gas condensate.
How do we turn gas that is found in the Beetaloo into manufacturing opportunities in the Northern Territory?
We need more gas coming out from under the ground. They'll create jobs, drive investment, and of course
Mark, part of the reason, the argument for the so-called gas-fired recovery was this jobs bonanza. That's often the case behind these kinds of projects. They argue that there's going to be lots of local jobs up there for it. Is that going to be the case? What's the economics like, more broadly speaking, for projects like this?
Well, if jobs was the outcome you were after, you would support virtually any other industry because the gas industry is a tiny employer and it's got a very, very low jobs intensity. So the more capital intensive industry is, the more, production you produce with machinery, essentially, and infrastructure. And a jobs intensive industry will provide more jobs because people do the work. The gas industry is way up the capital intensive end. So for every $1 million of output from the gas industry, you get about 0.4 jobs compared to over 10 in education and health. So yeah, you're basically giving loads of taxpayers' money to big global companies that pay virtually no tax in Australia that'll just go to their bottom line instead of giving it to industries that are labour intensive and provide services we need.
So hang on a second. So let me just get this straight. So not only is this project potentially it's going to harm groundwater, there's a lot of communities kind of opposed to it. It's a massive carbon bomb. It's costing the taxpayer a bomb. The gas that's coming out of it's not going to be cheap. There's not many jobs in it. And on top of all that, they're not even paying much tax. So we're not even getting anything back from, or not much back from them.
No, if you look over the border where it's all happened in Queensland, there's about 6 big companies. There's Origin, Sinopec, Shell, and a few others, and they pay. It's a massive industry. They're exporting vast amounts of gas, and none of them pay any company tax at all, or have paid any company tax at all for the last 4 years. And they're exempt from the petroleum resource rent tax, which is the other way that Australians can benefit from gas. And the petroleum resource rent tax used to be applied to onshore gas in Australia, but there was a review, the Callaghan review a couple of years ago, didn't recommend that they should be exempt from that tax, but the government decided to exempt them anyway following that review. So they're basically pretty much, from an Australian taxpayer's perspective, they're getting the resource pretty much for free. They do pay some royalties to the Queensland government, but in the scheme of things, they're virtually getting the resource for free.
Rod, I had no idea that we were so charitable. We're just giving our gas away.
Oh, we're incredibly charitable. And it's not just the Australian owners of our gas that are charitable. It's gas companies that are very charitable to Northern Territory politicians and interest groups.
It's a virtuous circle, really, isn't it?
Yeah. People might be at home scratching their heads as to why on earth would a Northern Territory government agree to this? And the simple answer is you look at people like former Conservative Chief Minister Adam Giles, who went off to work for Gina Rinehart, who has substantial fracking interests in the NT. Former Labor Chief Minister Paul Henderson went off to work for the NT Petroleum Club.
Martin Ferguson, former Energy Minister.
At a federal level, former Resource Minister Martin Ferguson, who's tied up with the gas lobby Appia. There's a lot of charitable gas companies if you're a person of influence in the NT. In fact, my favourite story on a personal note was I had some meetings with the Chief Minister's advisors at Parliament in Northern Territory, or the Legislative Assembly, and one of the Chief Minister's chief advisors came to our meeting with his coffee in an Appia mug. That's a mug sponsored by the gas lobby group. And I laughed and said to him, you might want to pick a different mug. And he laughed and said, "Oh, don't worry. Next time I meet with Appia, I'll take an Australian Conservation Society mug," which would, of course, have been a bit more reassuring if the Australian Conservation Society was an organisation that existed.
Yeah, might have meant the foundation, but that shows perhaps how much they talk to them on the regular. So, Mark, take us home. Where are we at the moment? What is the risk that the Northern Territory government is going to backflip and take us down this road?
Right. So the Northern Territory government has just released two policies. One is its draft offset policy, and the other is its large emitters policy. And the first thing that they do is that they don't count all the emissions. So they say that companies are going to some extent, have to offset their what's called Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, which is emissions from basically extracting and producing the gas, processing the gas, but they're not counting the one that probably accounts for most of the emissions, which is the combustion of the gas in Australia. So that directly contradicts recommendation 9.8, which says the full life cycle emissions. So they're just leaving out a huge chunk of the gas to start with. And then they have quite bizarre draft guidelines around the offsetting that's going to be required, that you could drive many large fracking, loopholes that you could drive many large fracking trucks through. And one of the more bizarre ones is they've invented this thing called indirect offsets. And you might think that maybe that's offsetting indirect emissions, but no, it's actually the offsets themselves are indirect because they won't actually offset. The company just has to put some money into funding some research into ways to reduce emissions, which no doubt will be one of the gas industry's kind of fake technologies like CCS. So it seems like the government's just been, fed a whole lot of ideas about how to get around this recommendation by the gas industry, and they're doing what they've been asked to do.
Words are important in these kinds of things, and we've been talking about no net increase and offsets. And here's the end of a statement. Some of this has been in the media this week. Here's the end of a statement from an NT government spokesperson that their large emitters policy sends a clear signal to this industry that the NT government expects the industry to manage its emissions.
Yeah.
So it used to be offsetting, it used to be no net increase, and now you just need to manage it.
Yeah.
Have a management plan, and that will comply with this policy, and there is the perfectly executed backflip.
Yeah.
I mean, the past couple of weeks I've talked about the fall of Afghanistan. I've talked about the massive assumption in the Doherty Institute modelling with the crisis that's unfolding in New South Wales at the moment and how concerning that is. And this is maybe one of the most depressing conversations I've had.
Do you need a hug, Eb?
Like, of all the recent catastrophes that have been because of poor policy, I mean, this one it's right up there. it's really appalling to get into the details of just, all the different ways they're trying to get around what they should be doing.
And it has real consequences because the Northern Territory is particularly particularly vulnerable to climate change. I mean, we all are. It's a disaster for all of us. But the Northern Territory, there's projections for massive increases in the amount of really hot days in the Northern Territory as a result of climate change. Sea level rise is more extreme in the Northern Territory than other parts of Australia. And, they already have an extreme climate. And I'm really concerned about everyone in the Northern Territory, but remote communities where they've got overcrowding in houses and little in the way of air conditioning. And you're getting this massive increase in extreme heat days. In Darwin, they're talking about, the CSIRO is saying that it'll go from a handful of days over 35 degrees currently to over 300 days a year over 35 degrees towards the end of the century. And it's hard to imagine the Northern Territory habitable in the same way as it is now. It has a huge impact on people's health and just your enjoyment of life when the climate changes that much. So people often, I say this because people often kind of, I guess, think, emissions is an abstract thing, but they're basically pumping these things into the atmosphere that are heating the place up, and it's just going to have really intense impacts on everyone in the Northern Territory, and the world, really.
Yeah, but I mean, on the upside, we won't get many jobs or much tax out of it. So, win-win.
Yeah. The Northern Territory government, in order to work through these recommendations, has farmed it out to an organisation called GESERA. And GESERA is an alliance of the 5 biggest fracking companies in Australia and a part of the CSIRO. And so essentially what they're doing is they're going to the gas industry and asking the gas industry what they think should be done about the recommendations. And that's and so you don't have an independent body working through this stuff. You've got the gas industry doing it itself. And that's essentially a corruption of the system.
Yeah, a little bit like how we had our national COVID committee made up of all the gas executives who were asked what we should do, and they came up with the gas-fired economic recovery.
But for anyone sitting at home thinking, the governments wouldn't really subsidise a big gas project into existence, would they? I mean, we're just talking a couple of $100 million here, that surely it's just a bit of small change, but it won't actually bring about any development. Well, no. The NT's got a massive history of this via a thing called the Black Tip Project. NT governments committed $4 billion to developing this offshore gas project off the coast of Wadair in the NT. It's lost huge amounts of money for the NT. It's siphoned huge amounts of money to the Italian gas company ENI. This has already happened before, and it looks like it's happening again. So anyone who's sort of thinking, maybe this, I'm sure there's some palms being greased, but no real harm done. No, we've sunk billions into the gas industry in the NT already, and we're set to do it again.
Thank you. That's all we've got time for, I'm afraid. We might have to think of a more happy topic to come to next week, because I feel like it's been week in, week out of just like really hardcore poor policy making here on Follow the Money. But look, thanks so much, Rod and Mark, for taking us through the details of that today. This episode was recorded on Tuesday the 7th of September 2021, and things may have changed since recording. On a separate note, how it's September already is beyond me. You can visit australiainstitute.org.au for all our latest research, including Mark's submissions to that NT gas submission and inquiry process. And we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is Ebony_Bennett with a NNT. Rod Campbell is at R_O_D_C. And Mark Ogue is at Mark Ogue. That's OGGE. Our producer is Jennifer Macy at Jennifer Macy, and our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Stay safe out there, everyone. I hope you're hanging in there, especially if you're in lockdown, and thanks for listening.